So to do that, we've got Marc Tucker, who's joining us by Skype. Marc was going to be here and came down with the flu, and the last email I saw from Marc says, if you haven't taken your flu shot already, do it. And so CVS or pharmacy's right down the street. You can get it at coffee break. And so Marc is director or CEO and president of the National Center on Education in the Economy. He's a leader in researching international practices of high-performing nations. I don't know anyone that can speak with more authority than what others are doing in high-performing nations and how that translates to the United States. I don't know anyone who speaks with more authority on the power of higher academic standards and what they mean than Marc does. And of course, he was one of the founders of the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards, its first president, so when you're talking about teaching and the importance of the classroom. So Marc will be joining us in just a second. Let me introduce Richard, and then Marc, if you'd get ready, wherever you are, pull that computer up. So as I mentioned with Richard, Richard is the person in the federal government, at least, that we look to, particularly at the Department of Education, for all matters technological. And so whether it's E-Rate, whether it's the President's Connect Ed initiative, whether it's, I hope Richard talks a little bit about Future Ready and getting thousands of school districts ready in going through the planning process necessary for technology. That's what Richard does. And so we're very, very fortunate to have them with us. Each of us is going to talk for about 10 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. So Marc, you ready?
I am.
Good. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You all set?
We're ready to go.
That's great. So very quickly, I have a few stories to tell you. I was lucky enough to get a grant from Carnegie Corporation of New York in the early 1980s to study the use of technology in education at all levels. And I did a bunch of things I want to tell you about, at least a little bit about them. One is I hung out in computer stores. And it was really interesting. They were brand new. There'd never been any such things before. And people who had very little training were waiting on people who didn't know anything about computers. Young men, they were mostly men, would walk into these computer stores and they would ask to be sold a computer. The retailer had been told to ask them what they were going to use it for, and they promptly said they had no idea. What can you do with them, they asked. These were young executives who were looking for a straight route to the corner office, and they wanted to do whatever it was that could be done with computers because they were convinced by what they had read that it was the fastest route to the corner office. Those same people, I discovered very quickly, were breaking down the doors to school superintendents, insisting that they make computers available to their own children. Because they didn't know they didn't know how they ought to be used in schools, but they were sure that if the kids were taught to use them, they too would have the same kind of advantage. I hung out in school districts that were leaders in the United States in introducing computers into schools. I remember one visit in particular very clearly up in North Shore of Long Island when a very proud superintendent who'd been featured in many magazines led me into a room where Macintosh computers were all lined up with the kids behind him. He told me how proud he was of this, sending these kids to this computer lab and how excited the kids were. But there was no excitement at all on their faces. These kids had the same dull expression that they did when they were doing their workbooks. And when I went around to the other side and saw the computer screen, I understood why. It was the workbooks on the computer screen. I asked him who had made the programs, and he told me proudly that they had been made by the math teachers in his middle schools. They did it at night for extra money and because they enjoyed it. I went to visit with those middle school math teachers, and they were teaching computer languages in their math classes to eager students. I asked the superintendent why they were doing that, and he told me that this was a 21st century skill. All kids were going to have to learn how to program computers. I went back to Washington and talked to a vice president of the Association for Computing Machinery. He said he believed not more than 30,000 people would have to know how to program computers in the years ahead, because what computer programmers were doing then in the 1980s were creating applications programs so that many people could use computers without having to program them. I went back to the superintendent and told him that. He was very angry with me. It turned out he wasn't really interested in preparing kids for the 21st century, and nor was he particularly interested in having the computers teach useful skills to kids. What he was really doing was trying to satisfy the demands of people outside the school system without creating too much of a ruckus inside the school system. So I went and found out I went to look to see whether there was any software that I would find exciting back in the 1980s, and indeed I did. I'll give you two examples. One was a program that had to do with searching for dolphins. It was made by McGraw-Hill and distributed by McGraw-Hill back in those days, and it was basically a simulation. And it was fascinating. If you actually used the program and used it well, you could teach kids mathematics, some of it fairly advanced, some of it fairly simple. You could teach them about ecology. You could teach them about biological systems. It was a very exciting piece of software, especially brilliant given how little memory they had at the time, but it wasn't widely used. And I hung out with a little program that I thought was absolutely brilliant. You could take a video that you might have shot, or a film of somebody, say, riding a bicycle. The program allowed you to superimpose on it a geometry visual. You could lock a picture of a circle onto the bicycle wheel, and excuse me, the software would then generate a lot of data and equations and graphics, which then enabled the student to see what happened to the curve in geometry created by the equation when the bicycle slowed down, when it speeded up, how fast it would get to its destination, all of that. You could, in effect, make the math textbook come alive on the screen. It met the same fate that the Dolphins program did. Now, why was that? Let me explain what I was looking at. What I saw, and this is the second slide, what I saw was the following. It became very clear to me that the decision makers I was looking at were not being motivated necessarily by improving instruction. There were many other things that were more important, and one of them was keeping everybody happy. That's what administrators learn as they go up the ladder in school systems, is you need to keep everybody happy, and it may or may not have something to do with actually improving the outcomes for kids. The teachers were focused on getting through their text. They were preparing kids for the tests. The reason that the Dolphins program and this brilliant geometry application weren't doing very well, because when the teachers saw them, they didn't get good answers to their questions of how it related to the textbook and its progression and what was being taught in it, nor could they figure out whether any of this was going to be on the test. It looked to them as though none of it was going to be on the test. They had very few incentives to use any of it. It looked to me, as I was looking at this software, that it was not going to be a very good teacher. And what I mean by that is that the best of teachers, when they're teaching mathematics, are trying to understand the misunderstandings that kids have in the mathematics so that they can sort the misunderstandings out and put the kids back on the right path. Computers, at least so far, and I mean today, cannot get inside a student's head that way and figure out the form of a misunderstanding of a concept. Similarly, it's extremely hard, in fact, literally impossible, for a computer to teach kids how to write really well. Those are the two single most important cognitive things that we do in school. What technology can do, and I saw it even in these very early programs, is greatly extend the reach of highly educated, very skilled teachers. Simulations, dynamic models, access to enormous libraries of visual and print materials, the ability to represent reality in multiple media in ways teachers cannot possibly do in class, are incredible extensions of the ability of first-rate teachers. But if the teachers lack the confidence that comes with deep mastery of subject matter, they cannot and they will not deviate from the text, and as the testing day approaches, from what is going to be on the test. I came to the conclusion that technology would not live up to its promise. until the United States resolves to make a major investment in the quality of its teaching force. I'm still waiting. Since the 1980s, there has been a massive increase in memory, speed, and connectivity. But nothing has caused me to change my mind about what it will take to release the potential of technology in our schools. There are, however, some recent developments that I think have some promise, real promise, for creating a new environment in which that potential will be released or could be released. They are the Common Core, they are the accountability movement, and the recent interest in teacher quality. I would argue to the people who are attending this conference, and my hat is off to you, I think what you're doing is very important, that your hopes and my hopes for what technology could do in this country to support education won't be realized until you focus hard on the Common Core state standards and ask yourself how technology can be used to release the potential that is locked in those statements about what kids ought to know and be able to do. It is a different kind of education than has been given to most of our kids. It focuses on real understanding of what they are being taught in a way that probably is not going to be realized for most kids unless we think very differently about technology. I would urge you to support sensible accountability systems, not the ones that are abroad in the land today, but those that I hope might succeed them. Because accountability will create a world in which educators have far stronger incentives to do what is necessary to help kids actually reach high standards than they have had in the past. And more than anything else, I would hope that you would give strong support to policies that will raise the quality of teachers in the United States. I don't think we're going to see what technology can do until we see teachers in every classroom who are very confident of their mastery of the subject, who will let the conversation go where it will, who don't depend on textbooks, who can manage a discussion that is electric in the classroom, one that technology can carry a very long way. Thanks.
And thank you for making a superhuman effort to be here. So, Richard, Marc traces the evolution in lots of ways of technology, and also at each step of the way documents the importance of quality teaching and talks about policy. So as the person who's at the seat of federal policy, but also one who is directly involved in what's going on and following in districts and states, interested in your reaction, and particularly as we all move to create this classroom that we think is so important and that Marc describes.
Yeah, so I was waiting for the other, I thought you were going to ask me one more question to throw on there. I'm thinking as quickly as I can how to respond to these great points that Marc made, which certainly puts a lot in perspective here. And thanks, Marc, by the way, for joining us this way. I actually offered to Bob, if he wanted, I could sit in the back and Skype in from the table over there just so we could be equitable in our use of technology, but you're stuck with me in person, I'm sorry. So you know, there's some interesting things here when we talk about where we're at now and the policy and really practice that we have to have if we want to talk about how we make the classroom of the future, the classroom of now, what we're hoping. And you know, it's a really great time. I think we've seen some awesome steps over the last couple years. We have a president who has making technology, a lever to transform learning as one of his highest priorities. We have, you've probably followed the Connect Ed initiative, which has now $2 billion plus in commitments from the private sector to help support schools. We have the $2 billion from E-Rate, if you've been following that, with some major updates, and I think we're all excited that those won't be the last of the updates we'll see in E-Rate for a while. So it's a great time. It's a great time to be you, frankly, but it's also forcing us to ask some really important questions, some challenging questions that may not have been some of the ones that we've asked enough in the past. So let me step out, let me share a couple of those with you here, of the policies / practices that I think we really all need to be thinking about. These are the things that keep me up at night. The first is, what's the role of technology in ensuring equity? right? How do we make sure that this is really flattening the world in the way it should? The infusion of technology has just as much potential to exacerbate the digital divide as it does to close it. And that depends largely on how we choose to use it. And so that means a lot of questions need to start coming into play, like what do we feel about this thing called BYOD, bring your own device policies, as a strategy? Does that really align to what we mean when we talk about providing equitable access for everybody? Right? So there's questions like that. On the higher ed space, it's things about access. Do we really need to have everybody coming to a physical location all the time? When the average student is not a 19-year-old guy out of high school. The average student is a 35-year-old mom with 2 kids working a full-time job. And so both on the K-12 side and the higher ed side, we have some questions to ask about access. The second is leadership. Who's preparing the leaders that are going to be making this transition, right? So I used to work in schools before they kicked me out to come here to the Department of Ed. And one of the things that was interesting to see was you had some really phenomenal leaders. People that I looked up to, but they were the math teacher who became a principal, who became a superintendent. Right? Nowhere along that path do we ever stop and say, how do you lead a digital transformation in your school? Right? And then we get frustrated because they don't know how to do this. And so we really need to be thinking, how are we preparing leadership for the future? There's some things that we are doing now. In fact, next month in November will be the first ever leadership superintendent summit at the White House, and we'll have superintendents from across the country coming together to share what they're doing to make this transition in effective ways. And then there's, leading up to that, some of you may have heard, we have this thing called the Future Ready District Pledge. So it's a pledge that districts voluntarily have taken to say that they're committed to making a transition, not just to digitizing traditional practice, but using technology to transform learning. And you can take a look at that if you haven't seen it. If you go to tech.ed.gov/future-ready, and I know Tom's going to tweet it out right here anyway, tech.ed.gov/future-ready, you'll see this Future Ready District Pledge, and we've had an overwhelming response from superintendents across the country who are pledging to make this transition. But how do we provide that help? How do we make sure they know what they need to know to lead this change? Third question we need to be asking is, what's the role of students in all of this? One of the things that just drives me crazy is adults sitting in a room talking about what students need. Where are the students? Right? Let's ask them what they need. Let's bring them into the conversation. I was recently visiting Cheraho Regional High School in Rhode Island, and they had a great transition plan to using technology in new ways in their school. And I was throwing questions out at them. I said, what do you think about privacy? And what's your plan for how did you select the devices you're going to use? And what's your plan for helping transition teachers and supporting teachers? They had great answers to all of them. And finally, I just said, I don't know that I've been in few places where I've had such well thought out responses to every question I've asked. How'd you get there? They said, well, meet the panel that helped us make this transition, and it was a whole team of students that they'd brought in. And so bringing students in and empowering them, I think, is a piece that we need to consider. The fourth thing, and I only have 5, by the way, so don't worry if you think I'm going to go on and on here. Fourth thing is we need to really think closely about what it means to create digital citizens. And what do we value when we think about citizenship of the future? So when I was in the classroom, citizenship were things like, don't steal from somebody's locker, don't run in the halls, right? These were these sort of things that we had about how to be a good citizen. What does don't run in the halls look like in a digital space, right? What does don't steal from somebody's locker look like in a digital space? And we need to be thinking very clearly about how to infuse those elements into what we're teaching. And it should be more than just a list of don'ts. I do worry in some cases where I say a digital citizenship curriculum and it's here, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's also, how do we do things like organize people around a cause in a digital world, right? Going and putting posters up around the town may not be the best way to do it anymore. How do we prepare our learners to take on that role? How do we prepare our learners to show empathy and support in online environments? And so we have questions, really important questions around creating digital citizens of the future that we need to be asking. And then my last thing is I think we really need to think thoughtfully about how we talk about what we're doing. And this is really on those of you here in the room. We need to talk in terms of outputs, not inputs. It's really exciting to hear about how many devices we've bought, or how many students now have access to something they didn't have before, or how much bandwidth we have in the classrooms now. And please don't misunderstand, that is extremely important, right? We don't do much learning if there's no electricity in the schools. We need inputs. I absolutely believe that. But that's not the story. And we need to be talking about, what did that do that's different than what it did before? And so if you catch yourself today and as you leave here talking about inputs, think about how you can shift that and shift to talking about, what is this changing? What are the outputs? What are things that are different? What does the experience look and feel like because of those shifts that are being made on the inputs? And I think if we all get better talking about what the outcomes are, I think that will accelerate the transition into this new learning space that we so desperately need if we want our students to be globally competitive and able to thrive in this globally connected world. So there are some thoughts that I hope we can think about over the next day or so here and talk about here on this panel. And I would just end my little spiel here with one thing to say. I had an interview the other day. Somebody was interviewing me, and they said, a year ago, you said this was the most exciting time that you've ever seen in terms of technology for transforming learning. Do you still feel that way now? I thought about it for a second, and I paused, to make it dramatic so that they would think they had a good story there. And I said, yes. I absolutely do. Seriously though, I absolutely feel that this is an amazing time to transform learning. But let's be clear, there's a window. And we have a chance to take advantage of that window and make some really impressive impacts in the way students learn, in the way teachers collaborate and connect. And if we can do that smart and do that now, for decades to come, we'll look back on this moment and say that was the time where the inflection point changed. And I hope that we can all be part of making that happen.
So, thank you, Richard. So,
Thanks.
So you've heard two very thoughtful individuals who have been involved in education and technology for a long time. Both have referred to the 1980s. So let me share my 1980s experience. I was mainly concerned about my polyester leisure suit for the disco lounge and how that looked. I wasn't thinking about these issues. But the other thing I did in the 1980s, and it goes to Richard's point, is I testified as a plaintiff in a school equity case in West Virginia. I was an expert witness on taxation at the time, and I was on the side, and it was all about inputs. This is 1981, and the case is whether or not, and actually the judge ruled in an interim opinion about the size of classrooms, how many square feet there had to be in gymnasiums, and so on. I signed the final agreement to that case 24 years later. As you know, school equity cases tend not to move very fast. I signed the final agreement for that case as the defendant, as the governor of the state. And at that point, it had shifted so much that I was signing basically an agreement that looked at the outcomes that students were having as the measurements for whether or not there was truly an equitable process going on. That's how far we've moved in accountability and equity. So I've got some basic premises in my 10 minutes here. First of all, that the classroom of the future is really the classroom of today, and that's what we need to be focusing on. And you all are making that happen, or about to make it happen already in all across the country. Second premise, this, as Richard says, this is one of the most critical times in American education in my lifetime, and I think probably historic in the sense of decisions are going to be made in every one of the 14 to 15,000 school districts in the next 2 to 3 years that are going to affect education in the next 20, because they have to decide how to implement a whole bunch of things and also what's the appropriate role of technology. So this is a critical period in American education. And the third premise is that none of this can happen if there isn't adequate planning. If those of you who are vendors and those of us who are urging effective application of technology, if we're simply selling stuff, then we failed. And we're going to crash and burn, quite frankly. And we already are seeing some examples of that. That what we have to have is a planning process which literally takes place at the district level, at the school level, at the state level as far as policy goes, that makes sure that every school district plans before it purchases, doesn't purchase and then plan. And finally, the market here is you've got to, the market, of course, is varied, but I just one of the things about the classroom of today is that students can check information right away. And so I wasn't being rude to Richard when I reached in. I wasn't texting or trying to keep up with Tom Murray on tweeting. I was checking a statistic, which is that half of the school districts in this country have, literally half the school districts in the country have less than 10,000 students. And they're the ones that are going to need a lot of assistance in planning. They won't be able to hire the consultants and others. So how can we, as an entity, as a group, help them? So here's what I do think is one of the differences, why I think technology is now at a different stage than it has been in the past. And Marc, I thought, brought out the difference, the evolution. First of all, it's interactive. When I grew up, many of you grew up, were in school, until fairly recently, it's been a one-way street. Whether you were looking at videos, whether you were looking at other presentations, it was one way. And it was from the teacher to the student, and it tended to be one device. That's number one. Number two is that technology now provides real-time data to teachers. It's not you're simply watching the educational movie. And that was sometimes more interesting than the teacher lecturing, but that teacher is getting real-time data from literally every keystroke. The third is that the teacher no longer has the monopoly over the learning activity. And good teachers say that the hardest thing they had to do was to learn to give up control. Not control of the classroom, but control of the learning process. And to be able, so that as the students are now able to learn, they learn how to learn. And so the teacher assists them. The teacher, I think, as one superintendent says, this doesn't diminish the role of teacher, it enhances it, because the teacher using the data is now an educational designer and is able to personalize education for each student's needs. Another difference is the price points are dropping. And so it's the monopolization of the education process and the devices has changed, as every student now has some sort of learning device, one-to-one device. So it is that one reason for that is that the price points have dropped. And so that laptop, iPad, whatever it is, that was so expensive just a few years ago is now the price of a textbook. And as you cost out the textbook over 5 to 6 years, you quickly see which is inert. I mean, I've got two things that begin to depreciate in value as soon as I buy them. A textbook and a car. And so, particularly my cars. And so, but with the one-to-one device, that value only continues to increase in terms of learning. So there are many other differences as well, but I think these are some of the critical ones that have emerged in the last decade. But I've got to get back to this planning. And that's why I think it's so important that and a number of you are involved in the planning process, and there are other organizations besides mine and others. But the planning is critical, and that's why what is coming out of the Connect Ed initiative by the administration, this Future Ready, in which they're convening 100 superintendents at a White House summit with the goal, and I think you've got over 1,000 superintendents that have now signed a pledge to go through a planning process. We have to make sure that there's a ready, easy to access self-assessment and planning process in place that every district can readily use. And once again, the larger urban districts and some of the suburban districts, they've already been able to get there. But I called a superintendent last year in a small district who's doing a lot in technology, and they told me he wouldn't be in that day. And I said, "Oh, is he okay?" And he said, "Yeah, but the bus driver's sick, so he's out driving the bus." Well, this is somebody who doesn't have a lot of time to engage in planning. And so how can we assist him or her to do that? There are some major issues that I think that, and then I'm going to tee them up and perhaps people want to talk about. Richard mentioned equity, so I'm going to leave that one, but understand how important it is. This is about all children. It's not about some. It's not about a few more than we did before. The goals that have been set in this country in every state are about all children. I can also give you the economic reasons why there's an economic imperative that it's all children as well as a moral imperative. So that's one. The second major issue is about, and Marc talked about this too, it's teacher preparation. We don't get anywhere unless the teachers are properly prepared and embracing this. And many are, and a lot more are coming through the pipeline, but what's the education they're going to get? But here are two that are on the burner right now. Connectivity. Richard mentioned the E-rate. That's the the single greatest reform in education that's taken place in my mind in the last several years, the single greatest change, did not come from any agency of education. It came in a few months ago from the Federal Communications Commission, which adopted a rule that put $2 billion more into connecting schools and libraries to the internet and giving them Wi-Fi. And so the question is whether, in going back as the FCC is now looking at doing, is whether even more money is put into the connectivity. President Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. To me, the E-rate is the interstate highway system of our generation. The second major issue, and if you haven't run into this one yet, get ready for it, because it'll bite you, and that's data and privacy. If we don't come to grips with data and privacy and make sure that every state and district has in place policies that the public readily understands and supports, that they understand the importance of using data for instruction, for that classroom teacher to have that dashboard. They understand the privacy policies that are in place and the security measures that are intact. Why is that so critical? Because I said this is about all children and personalizing education. You can't do that if parents are opting out, as is the case in some school districts now, opting out so that a teacher is standing up in front of a classroom and half the students have opted out of having their data be able to be used, and meanwhile he or she has the most modern dashboards available for the other half. And so we've got to urge and be, through codes of conduct and others, data and policy. Why is this such an exciting time? 4 major reasons, and they've been each mentioned. Common Core standards or college and career ready, depending on where you are. In the last 5 years, every state has raised its game considerably and said, we want our students to graduate college and career ready. For 40 states, that's a Common Core. For 8 or 10 others, that's some sort of college and career ready. Much higher standards, changing role of teaching, and Marc talked about this some. Third is constrained budgets. And then the fourth is, as we've all been talking about, the rapidly emergence of educational technology readily available to all, price points dropping. It's an amazing time to be in this marketplace, and it's an amazing time to be transforming education. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions. I do have one question I'd like to ask Marc. And so Marc, you kind of answered this, but you got to be, you're a contrarian on technology somewhat. At the same time, you also point out it's positive. Technophobe or technophile, which is it?
It's both.
Okay, I love it. It's Washington, D.C., it's both.
It's both. No, it's not Washington, D.C., it's just me. And let me just explain. I got my first job in technology when I was in my late 20s. It was 1964. I was asked by my boss at WGBH-TV in Boston to be the number 2 person in a new technology division he was setting up for the schools. And I told him I didn't know a damn thing about it. He said, that's okay, you're in a great position to learn. And I went out and I sat down and I started to read. And the first thing I read was a set of congressional hearing testimony from the early 1960s about what was going to happen with the introduction of 16-millimeter film into our schools. The Ford Foundation had been putting a ton of money into this. And then I read what was going to happen with 8-millimeter film. And I'm sure you can fill in the rest of the story. I have seen rhetoric about what the introduction of technology is going to accomplish in American schools that goes back a long way, 50 or 60 years. And what I've seen in the last 20 years is one nation after another surpassing the United States in education achievement in international comparative tests. You know the tests I'm talking about, Bob. And we have been surpassed in achievement by one country after another, over 20 of them now, by countries that have been way behind us in the introduction of technology in schools. I have waited to see a report that shows that technology makes an enormous difference in outcomes for kids, and I haven't seen it yet. That's the technophobe in me. On the other hand, this comes back to what I said in my remarks earlier. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that in the hands of really fine teachers who really understand the subject matter, this technology can absolutely transform student achievement. I just don't doubt it for 1 minute. But I don't think, it comes back to something that my partner on this platform said in his remarks. I don't think that the statistics that show that there's more and more technology in use in the schools have been translating into comparable impacts on the bottom line in student achievement. And until we figure out how to do that, I'm going to be right straight in the middle here. I honestly believe, Bob, that we are not going to get there until we have first-class teachers who are not spending all their time tied to the textbook, who are not worrying most of the school year about how kids are going to do on rotten, cheap tests, who have enormous ambitions for their kids and have the education and training to achieve them. You won't have to sell technology to them. They are going to reach out for it, and they're going to use it in ways you never dreamed of. That's why I am both a technophobe and a technophile.
Fair enough, and it's a good way to present both points of view. Richard, so in terms of where you think, you talked about this being a critical stage. Could you expand on that a little bit and where you think what the main issues are going to be in the next 2 to 3 years that we have to address, and particularly those in this room?
Yeah, so the main, I don't know, I have a list of issues. So I think there are a number of things that are critical to address. Some of them are the things that we're hearing Marc say. So I got to say, I don't actually buy into the whole, we hear this sort of argument again. We heard the transparency was going to transform education, it didn't. We heard the video was going to transform education. There's always some silly quote that somebody made somewhere that's brought up, and then we say, because it hasn't done these things in the past, that means why should we bother doing this? It's going to go the same way. I don't buy into that argument. And the reason I don't buy into that argument is because I have seen where it's transformed education, and it is amazing. It blows your socks off. But the challenge that we have is because it transforms in one place does not mean that it transforms across the country. We have a scale issue. We have a scale problem here. And while I can go to great schools and see what personalized learning looks like when every student has the opportunity to have agency and control over their learning, and when the technology is used to create creators and not just passive soakers uppers of content, right? You can see those wonderful things, and what's frustrating for me is when you walk across the street to the next district over and it's a completely different story and doesn't look like that at all, and does look like the sort of the cases that would seem to fuel the, other media never made a change in the past, so why should this? And so I think the big challenge that we're going to have to deal with is, how do we scale? How do we talk about what's working well in ways that's useful? And part of that is talking about outcomes, but also it has to do with things like asking better questions. So much of the research out there, I think, is not very helpful. We take these studies where we say, we're going to take these kids and we're going to have them use paper textbooks, and we're going to take these kids and have them use digital textbooks, and look, no significant difference. Well, of course not. I could tell you that. It's the same dang textbook. Just one is a digital version and one is not. And so I think what we're going to have to start doing is looking at also better research of effectiveness, and not just do these sort of silly A/B trials of tech versus non-tech, but actually show models that were not possible before and measure those and show what outcomes are happening, and then sort of model one against another. So those are the things I think that we need to look at, is how do we deal with the scale challenge in the country, and how do we ask better questions, especially when it comes to research.
And what I hear from both of you is that it's both T's. It's the quality teaching, which is uppermost, and as I mentioned earlier, only enhances the role of teaching, and we need to stress that. And then at the same time, it's the technology that gives that teacher the ability to truly be that educational designer, whether it's a strictly online teacher, whether it is a teacher in a classroom bringing in online content, whether it is digital interactive software, but it's still, there's something that isn't going to change from the University of Bologna style 800 years ago, and that is the importance of the teacher. But it's what the teacher does, and it's how that teaching process is transformed. That's where the power of the technology is, and particularly that's coming on. So,
And Bob,
yeah,
one thing that I think is important. Sorry, and we real quick, just on that example of teacher versus technology, right? We tend to sometimes set those up as an opposite, and somehow we just need to call out how silly that is, right? So I'm a private pilot, as you know, Bob, and one of the things that I think you don't hear is say, when we're talking about flying, is it the pilot or is it the plane? I don't know. Could we do one or not the other? Like, nobody has that argument in flying. You know that you got to have a really, really competent pilot. And you got to have a really awesome plane that actually works and does what it needs to do. And I think that's the same way we need to be thinking about education. We need to have teachers that are powered by the tools that they need. Marc, sorry.
Yeah, Marc, I think you want to jump in, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to illustrate the point with another story. Years ago, my friend Seymour Papert, who was then working hard on what became known as Lego Logo, asked me if I would take a day and go over to the Timothy School in Boston. And we arrived on a day when the classes were out, but there was one girl, middle school girl, in a red dress, and she was in the Lego lab. And there were, I guess, 2 or 3 of us there, and we asked her what a particular construction was, and she took it up and she explained that it followed a track of masking tape on the ground. She put it down and it didn't work. And she said, "Oh, God, what went on here?" She opened up the Apple computer that she had. She looked at the program. There was something wrong with the code. She fixed it and it worked like a charm. And we then pointed to a construction about, maybe almost 2 feet tall on a workbench that was not far away. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. And she said it was one of those great big walking machines from Star Wars, which had just come out. And we asked her to demonstrate that. And it was astonishing. The thing walked exactly like one of those walking machines. We asked her about how that had come to be. And she said the whole class had to work on it because it was so complicated, and then it almost stopped entirely because they couldn't figure out how to duplicate the motion that they saw in the Star Wars movies. We then went and found the teacher in that class, and the teacher explained to us that motion was an elliptical motion. And in order to construct the code to have the computer run it properly, the kids had to create code which would produce that elliptical motion. The teacher didn't know how to do it, so they went to the math teacher. Math teacher had not been involved, but the math teacher took the problem on. It turns out that the mathematics of elliptical motion is taught in graduate school in mathematics. It's not taught in high schools. It's not taught in college mathematics. You have to wait until graduate mathematics. The middle school teacher at the Timothy School, math teacher, went to MIT. Seymour gave the proper introductions and found somebody on the math faculty at MIT who would help these kids figure out the mathematics of elliptical motion so they could create this Star Wars machine. My point is the following. None of this was in the syllabus for any of these courses. None of it would appear on an examination. The math teacher didn't have the foggiest idea what math was required to solve the problems the kids wanted to solve. But the teacher had enough confidence in herself and in her ability to help them with the mathematics once they found an expert in it, that these kids ended up doing graduate level mathematics in order to build a machine that my guess is most college professors would have a hard time helping their students build. That's my point. It's none of that would have been possible without the technology. But without teachers who are willing to admit they didn't know and who were willing to go and find out and willing to go down a path that wasn't in the textbook and were willing to spend time doing something that wasn't going to be on the test, none of it would have happened.
Yep. Great point. So, first question, if you would identify yourself, please.
Steve Rappaport. This question is from Marc Tucker. Marc, you recently wrote a paper, a very important paper that I highly recommend to everybody in this room, on accountability systems. You don't talk much about technology, and understandable, it wasn't the focus of the paper. But I'm curious about your thoughts on how technology can be, applies to the restructuring of the accountability system that you talk about in two respects in particular. First, you talk about the need for new assessments, something that a lot of people in this room have been thinking about for many years. And second, you emphasize the importance of changing the practice and the profession of teaching, in part by increasing collaboration among teachers, which you cite as a very significant difference between the United States and other countries. What role do you see technology could play in facilitating collaboration among teachers and also changes in assessments?
Oh my. Well, I'm going to resist the temptation to summarize the paper. So just focusing in on a couple of key points. With respect to testing, what I say in that paper is that the United States, alone among the industrialized countries, is wed to cheap tests. And one of the reasons we don't seem to be able to get beyond cheap tests is because we require in our national accountability system year-by-year testing. So I propose that we have many fewer accountability tests, no more than 3 in a student's lifetime, and that those tests be much, much better tests, able to test a far wider range of student abilities, knowledge, and skill than our current tests do. My hope is that the tests coming out of the 2 state consortia are going to be far better than the kinds of fill-in-the-blank tests that we have had in the past, computer-scored multiple-choice tests. Those tests are highly technology-dependent, as I'm sure you know. They could not be done in the form in which they're going to be administered were it not for the use of advanced technology. Not just the fact that computers will be required for the testing, but the design of the very sophisticated test design, which will incorporate, in mathematics, for example, a lot of advanced software technology that will enable the student taking tests to actually manipulate objects on the screen, and so on. So that's one answer to your question. Very important, I believe. The second is that the design that I have in mind is one that would professionalize teaching, take it away from the blue-collar occupation it has been for far too long, and create a real profession of teaching in which we have far greater trust for our teachers than we have had thus far. And in that model, I think, it comes down to what I've been saying earlier. I think that when teachers are able to, very well-educated and very well-trained teachers are working together in groups in their schools to create much better lessons than they are able to create now because they don't have the time, the background, or the training. They will become much more intensive users of technology because they will see the potential in it that we've all been talking about. And they will have the opportunity to develop that potential in an environment in which there are many fewer accountability tests. The accountability is on the students, not the teachers, which is what the top performing countries do. And the technology is available. I'm absolutely convinced of that. That's the technophile side of me.
Okay, good. So next question over here.
Yeah. Richard and Bob, Marc's last example really concerned me a little bit. And the reason why it concerned me is because it was such a brilliant example of teaching. And it occurred so long ago. And I think that if that was to occur today, it would still be a brilliant example of teaching and an anomaly. So my question is, from a policy perspective, what is actually happening that's making 2014 more effective than, I forgot exactly what year that was, Marc, but 1976, let's say.
Let's say, yep, about that.
So Richard, you want to start it?
So one of the things that I would sort of agree with is that we don't see this is my conversation before, we don't see sort of at scale huge shift that we would like to see. But when we look at examples where there's fantastic work going on, there tends to be some things in common, and some things I think are look very, very different than they did before. So one of them is this idea of personalized learning and how that's being supported. Some of you may be aware that the Department of Education funds has made a significant investment in about 50 districts across the country to show what personalized learning looks like. What it looks like when every student has an experience that adapts to their needs, that adapts to their approach, different approaches, and also is tied to interests and passions. And that same applies for the teachers. The teachers know how and where to use their time in the best possible way. That looks very different, right? Having been a teacher, I never had an opportunity to have tools that help me say, hey, here are some kids that you need to spend more time with because we have a sense of where their challenges are, right? My time was used so inefficiently. And so I think those are types of examples that I'm very excited about and look very, very different. One of the pieces that we came up with this idea of testing and what a challenge testing is, I totally agree. And I agree that one of the problems is that we're data starved. Right? Why do we think that tests, we make such a big deal of these sort of end-of-year assessments, and I do think they'll be better with the new assessments that are coming out, but still, it's sort of such a big deal because we're so data-starved for the rest of the year. Right? If I knew exactly where every student was at in my class, it's not that big of a deal when I take the test at the end. I know that. I knew where they were the day before. I knew where they were the day after. And that's another option that technology provides, which is this idea of being able to blur the lines between what's assessing and what's learning, right? To the point that it happens together. That's fantastic. Those are things we did not see before. But we're not seeing them at scale. And in order to get them at scale, we need to make some real serious decisions as a country about how we're going to support teachers and how we're going to prepare leaders to lead those changes.
I guess what I see is, and I'm actually pretty bullish because in the last 5 years, as I mentioned, I've seen every state raise its standards significantly, but it's not just saying you've got to know more in English, language arts, and math. It incorporates what we call the deeper learning concepts, which are you have to have core content knowledge, but you have to be able to do something with it. It's performance assessments instead of rote assessments. It's the ability to solve problems. It's the ability to work as a team, to collaborate, and to also be an agent of your own learning. And that's a standard that's applied for all children, regardless of their income, race, ethnicity, or whatever. Because these are the skills, the talents, the competencies that we need today in the process. And so I'm seeing more states and school districts implement those policies. Policies alone don't drive it, but policies can help practice. And as Richard says, and Marc has been talking about, practice can help shape those policies. Marc, do you want to add something quickly? We've got some other questions.
Yeah, very quickly. To me, scale is a matter of two things: incentives and support. People are not going to do the things you want them to do unless they have incentives, unless the incentives to do them are stronger than the incentives not to, and they're not going to be able to, even if they have the incentives, unless they have the support. I don't think simply training people in technology is going to accomplish much unless you address both incentives and support. I think that, as Bob says, and I said earlier, I think the Common Core is going to, combined with better accountability systems, is going to change the incentive structure. More and more teachers will be interested in finding ways to help kids gain much more complex knowledge than they have before, and that's going to drive them toward technology.
Okay. Over here, yes.
Hi, Jean Fleming from Northwest Evaluation Association. Appreciate the comments on assessment and its role in learning. We talk so much about accountability, but it really has a much bigger role in learning, so thank you for that. Richard, a couple of questions for you. One is actually a comment. You called out the student voice, which we are very passionate about at NWA. We just did a big survey on assessment that asked students what they think of it, and we discovered that they have an incredibly nuanced understanding of it. They know what works for them in terms of learning and what doesn't work for them, and the closer to the learning moment, the better. Just a little hint there. If you're interested, please visit nwa.org and look for Make Assessment Matter. That's the plug. So my question, though, for you is to tie your first comment, which was about equity, which I think is so important, with your last question, which is it's not about inputs, it's about outputs. And so much of the equity conversation is about input, right? It's about access. We've got this many computers per kid, et cetera. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that is this challenge, is just how do we start asking different questions and sharing our story in different terms, right? So again, to reiterate what I said before, you got to have the inputs, right? We got to have devices, we have to have electricity, we have to have water, we have to have broadband in schools, and I do classify those all together. We do have to have highly prepared and highly qualified teachers. But I think what really comes down to is when you look at schools and you say, as you split out across the different demographics that you have there, what growth are you seeing? What changes are coming? And those are the stories that we need to tell. I love when I hear stories about what students have done that they couldn't do before. I was in a school in West Virginia, somebody here may know something about this, where they were talking about students that had used open data to discover stars. They discovered a number of stars. It was fascinating to hear these students that had discovered a star using, right? So it doesn't always have to be test scores as the output, is my point. I was in another school in Tucson, Arizona, Sunnyside School District, where all of the students in the freshman English class had written a novel by the end of the year, right? That's an awesome output. And so yes, we do care about looking at scores, and test scores are important, but there's lots of other outputs that we should be considering, which are the things that students do, that they make, that they become, and especially when we can look at those students who did not have opportunities to do those things before. And that's what we all got to figure out, is how do we tell those stories?
Yeah, I'm often struck by the importance of assessments, but I also believe that with technology and what research and practice with teaching is showing is that assessments can be much more positive than they have been, particularly formative ones. But also I question whether or not the assessments we're spending so much time on that will be the assessments for the next 5 years, whether we're fighting last year's war, and whether indeed what we're going to be seeing in 5 to 10 years is not an assessment that you're measuring a student by, but a digital portfolio, and that they're going to be, and we see some of that already, and whether that's going to become much more the norm. Mark, if I could, I'm going to jump over you so we can get 2 more questions, unless you wanted to throw something in real quickly.
No.
Okay,
No.
so now, let me come over here.
Good morning. My name is Jared Schurz. I have more of a statement than a question. Richard, I believe I heard you say that one of your hopes for us were that we would promote more empathy in the work that we're doing, especially with technology. And I was very excited to hear you say this, because as a researcher and advocate of school safety and the reduction of school violence, one of the most important tools we can have for that is is encouraging students to be able to be more empathic, because technology inherently has a limitation of putting kids in their head, not in their experiences, which is where empathy is developed. And people in this room are in a unique position to be able to bring in that empathy into the products and the services that they're developing. And I'm so committed to that cause that at no cost I would be willing to consult with anybody who's in that line of work, who wants to learn how to bring empathy into their product or services. And as a psychologist, this is what I do for a living. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, sir, over here.
My name's Wayne Harvey from EDC, and my question intersects things that all 3 of you said. And by the way, I think you brought some extremely important and thoughtful perspectives to the meeting. So it's mostly about this notion of planning, but part of what planning is planning over time and into the future years. And there's a sustainability of programs in schools challenge. Programs come and go, but they're not sustained over time, and they're generally not planned over long periods of time. And some of that has to do with accountability. I mean, teachers and administrators are accountable to today's parents and accountable to this year's performance. So I'm raising the question of, given all the constraints in terms of how time and resources figured in schools, how planning could occur over long periods of time, and without this trust me attitude, in 5 years things will be better if you do what we say now. So I think that's a real big challenge, and I wonder what your thoughts are on meeting that.
So, as I hear completely and agree with what you're saying, but I think so what we at the Alliance for Excellent Education do, and Tom Murray's here, who heads up our Project 24 planning process, we offer online a totally free self-assessment for school districts about where they are in terms of technology using technology, but also the culture there, and then 7 elements to work through. But we don't start with the technology. I think any kind of planning, and every district does this hopefully in some sort of strategic way, you start with what are your learning outcomes that you're seeking. And in most districts, of course, it's going to be the adoption or the implementation of the Common Core or college and career ready standards. You look at the unique challenges of that school or district in terms of free and reduced lunch or whatever, geography or whatever it is. And to me, you set your goals for what you're trying to achieve in learning, you look at your challenges, and then you look through how it is you're changing the role of teaching. You mentioned time. We haven't talked at all about competency-based advancement, but it's becoming, you look at the state of New Hampshire, which has moved that way rapidly. You look at other states and districts where technology is enabling teachers to work so that they can move students at their pace instead of this Carnegie seat time unit of 180 days. So you do the teaching, you work through how you're going to use time, whether flipping classrooms all the way to competency-based advancement, and then you look at what's the appropriate technology for what it is that you just set out to do. If you're in rural West Virginia and you don't have connectivity at the home or in an urban area, then you're going to adapt a different type of technology for those students, hardwired computers or laptops and so on, than you're going to be if you've got rapid connectivity. But it seems to me, and you also have to bring the public in on this as well. So you're right that there's never a plan that's perfect for every situation for 5 to 10 years out. But at the same time, I think you've got to start with this process, and particularly at a time when you're getting ready to make a transformation. The Common Core isn't about tweaking. The Common Core is about transforming how students learn and how teachers teach. And so that requires serious planning. But Marc, do you want to jump in on that?
No, actually, I don't. Thanks. I don't think I have anything to contribute on this point.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, my name's Willa
Vicky.
Perlman. I have 2 questions, if I may. The first is, you've outlined a number of really critical issues for all of us to think about. I would love to hear, particularly from Richard, in maybe a more granular fashion, what we can look to the Department of Ed for in terms of specific leadership on some of these issues. What are some of the specific initiatives that you're going to be focusing on with respect to the issues that you've raised, particularly with a mind toward, truly impacting policy? My second question is, we've talked quite a bit about the need to improve the skills of better trained teachers, and much of that conversation has been about teachers who are already teaching.
Yeah.
But what is the Department of Education doing with respect to changing the way emerging teachers are being taught, and perhaps changing even the certification requirements so that they're better aligned with the needs of the present-day classroom?
So thank you, great questions, and that could be a whole panel just talking about those issues that you brought up. Since we are close on time, I'm going to give you a very quick version of that, but happy to follow up with you and others if you want some more details about what's happening in the department. A number of things that are going on that are important. I already mentioned one, which is this district personalized learning program, Race to the Top District, investing in supporting personalized learning models, with the theory that if we have some really solid models of personalized learning across a district, it'll be easier to take and learn from those lessons. We have a guide that will be coming out in a couple weeks, in about a month, that actually looks at what we're learning, some of the things that we're seeing around what makes personalized learning work and what doesn't. And so that's one piece of it. We have, my boss, Secretary Duncan, has asked Congress for additional funding specifically to support teachers in using technology effectively, not just for teaching students, but also for their own professional learning. And just recently, I sent out a Dear Colleague letter talking about how federal title funds could be used, allowable use could be transitioning to using technology effectively, especially in the Title II arena, which is how we use our funding to support teachers. Right now, there's $2 billion of funding that is, I think, largely not used in very effective ways. It's often used for bringing people together and having a speaker come in front of the room and talk about teaching. What would that look like if that funding was used to help teachers connect and collaborate in virtual spaces? October is Connected Educator Month, which is a project that came out of my office, and it's an opportunity for all teachers to connect and collaborate online. So there's a couple examples right there. There are a number of others, and I don't want to sort of go through the laundry list here, but happy to talk about more things that we're doing. But man, we've got to really push. And sorry, one other, because you did mention the teacher preparation. We absolutely believe that this is a priority. Look, we spend so much time trying to help get teachers that are in service up to speed, and I've talked to a number of superintendents that have said, look, if you just fix the problem with teachers coming in, eventually, if you run the clock long enough, we'll have things looking like a better situation. So you'll be seeing some things very soon coming up that will be focusing on that.
The constraints of time in education are also here, I might add. And so it looks like this period is over. So I want to thank everyone. And Marc, thank you very, very much. Let me say to everyone, if you want more information on any of the material that Marc talked about and a lot more, go to the website National Center on Education and the Economy, NCEE. And you'll get that. And so, Marc, thank you for participating. And I just want you to know that via technology, I got the message I'm going to go get my flu shot right away. Richard Culatta, thank you for the department, perspective of the department. And please watch for Future Ready coming soon to a district near you. And so, in closing, sometimes one of the most blessed words that a former politician can say. In closing, let me just say what I said in the opening, which is this is, I think, one of the most exciting times to be in education. Every district has to make critical decisions about how to implement these higher outcomes for students, how to get there, and you're an integral part of that process. We got to do it right. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marc.